This video talks about relative clauses. I recommend that you watch the video on the anatomy of sentences with clauses first. So we're going to start with a simple sentence. Here it is. And I'm going to put a related simple sentence, similar. And both of these sentences have something in common, the word Susan. When I have sentences like this, I can combine them using a certain pronoun to create a relative clause. I have a complex sentence now. You might recall that a complex sentence is an independent clause and a dependent clause. And in this case, my dependent clause is my relative clause. It is relative, it is related to the other clause in the sentence. Now the way that these work, the way that they're connected together is with special words. And you see here I have a word that represents Susan. This word is called the relative pronoun. And relative pronouns refer to noun phrases in the independent clause, and that's how these are connected together. So let's look at our relative pronouns. These are the two most common, well, two of the most common. For people, we use the word who, and for things we use the word which. And I have two examples here. Note that we can generally, almost always, use the word that to replace who or which. For people or things, you can use the word that. And it doesn't change the meaning at all. So these are the three most common relative pronouns that you will find: who, that, and which. So when we're talking about relative pronouns, an important topic to mention are optional relative pronouns. Optional pronouns in the relative clause. So I'm going to show you some examples to show you what I mean by that. Here I have two sentences that have relative clauses. They're pretty similar. They're both about Liam the applicant. And you'll see Liam was the applicant is my independent clause in each sentence. Here are my relative pronouns. Remember, you can use who or that. Let's break these sentences into their separate clauses. So here we go. On the left, I have my independent clause. On the right, my relative clause. Now, if you look just at the first example, here there's a subject in the first clause, Liam, and there's a subject in the second clause, the boss. And what I'm really saying in the second clause is the boss wanted to hire Liam. And if you analyze this little sentence, the boss is the subject, the verb phrase is wanted to hire, and Liam is actually the object here. Liam is the object of this clause, meaning the relative pronoun here is what we call object relative. It refers to an object and not a subject. It's referring to Liam as the object of the second clause. If you're a real stickler for grammar, then you might say, wait a minute, it's whom the boss wanted to hire, and yes, that's technically correct, but most people will just say who, so we're just going to stick with that. It's important to note, though, that we have two visible subjects, Liam and the boss. We can see both subjects, and that's usually a big indicator that we're dealing with an object-relative clause. What's important to note about object-relative clauses is that they are optional. I do not need to, object-relative pronouns are optional. I do not need to mention who or that. If I want, I can just remove this. And now I have a sentence, Liam was the applicant the boss wanted to hire, and it makes perfect sense. It's not necessary to have that pronoun. So when the pronoun is object-relative, it is optional. I'm just going to put it back in there so we can see. But look at the second sentence. Here's my subject, Liam. Where's the other subject? There's no obvious subject in the second clause, because what I'm really saying is Liam was wearing an ugly tie. I'm referring to the same subject. And so the who or that is replacing the subject of the sentence, not the object, or the subject of the clause. So it is subject relative. When it refers to Liam, it's referring to the subject of that clause. Subject relative pronouns are required. See what happens when you try to remove this. It makes absolutely no sense. We need to have this pronoun in order for the sentence to work. So When it is object relative, it's optional. Subject relative, it's required. So these two examples are about a person. Let's just look at some more examples using a thing so that we can use the pronoun which. So here I have two examples with which or that. Remember, you can use both. Those are the two different clauses. On the left, the independence. On the right, the relative clauses again. Those are my pronouns, which or that. Now let's just look at the first one again. This one's object relative, and remember the big indicator is we have two different subjects. In the first one, the subject, Beth. In the second one, the subject, I. So in the second clause, I'm saying I recommended it. It is the object. I recommended a restaurant. So that is an object relative pronoun. It is optional. I can take it out. And I have a perfectly good sentence there. The second example, that's the place which or that has really good tempura. You'll notice that the second clause, has really good, doesn't have a subject. The subject is the pronoun. Subject relative, so it's required. You cannot remove this relative pronoun. So optional pronouns is an important topic. Another very important topic with relative clauses is whether our clause is defining or non-defining. And I'm going to show you what that means now. So first of all, here's a sentence. Again, we're talking about an applicant. And here's another one, and you'll say, like, these sentences are almost exactly the same. The first one, the guy who wore an ugly tie, and then maybe you say, oh, I remember him. His name was Liam. Liam, who wore an ugly tie, was the first applicant we saw today. Now, they both have relative clauses. They're both about the exact same person, but there is a slight difference in how they work. So, first of all, let's identify the relative clause in the first one, who wore an ugly tie. If I remove this is my relative clause. Let's just take it out entirely. Look at the sentence I have here. Grammatically, it's okay. The guy was the first applicant we saw today, sure. But it leaves the listener wondering, what guy are you referring to? Unless we've set in context who this guy is, this is sort of an incomplete idea. So the relative clause, who wore an ugly tie, helps establish who the guy is. It defines him. It is a defining clause. Now, if you look at the second example, here's my relative clause again, same one, but let's remove it. And this sentence is a little more complete, assuming that we know who Liam is, or we know who the first applicant was. It's more of a complete idea, and the relative clause is non-defining. Meaning it's not necessary for our understanding of who Liam is to have this. It's extra information, a sort of by the way. By the way, he was wearing an ugly tie, but what's important is he was the first applicant we saw today. A very important thing to note about a non-defining clause are those two little commas there. Note that the non-defining clause is offset from the rest of the sentence by two commas or by one comma if it appears at the end. You can hear this in the way that a person says it as well. There's a little pause there. Liam, who wore an ugly tie, was the first applicant we saw today. One other thing we should note, if you look at the first one again, the guy that wore an ugly tie, remember we can always use that to replace the who or which. Well, not in a non-defining clause. You cannot say that here. When it's non-defining, we need to use who or which. Only in defining relative clauses can you use that. Okay, another thing to mention with non-defining relative clauses is the person who makes the sentence, the person who utters the sentence or writes it, gets to decide what information is deemed essential and what information is extra or non-defining. So in this sentence, the essential information, the second sentence, the essential information is that Liam was the first applicant. The by the way extra information is that he wore an ugly tie, but I'm going to just reorder the ideas here. And now I have Liam, who was the first applicant we saw today, wore an ugly tie. And in this sentence, the essential information, maybe someone asks, like, who was that guy in the ugly tie? And what's important in the sentence is the fact that he wore an ugly tie. And I just want you to know, for your information, he was the first applicant we saw today. So it's a bit of a strange sentence, but you can decide which information is essential and which is extra. Now, sometimes your students, or even lots of native speakers, we think like, well, how do I know when I make a sentence that contains a relative clause if it should be a defining or a non-defining? And really, it's up to you in most cases how you want to order the information. But certain sentences just sound better as non-defining or just sound better as defining. For example, if you look at the very first example again with the guy, let's change this into a non-defining clause. It's fine, we can do that. Grammatically, sure. But we're back to that original problem where the listener is thinking, what guy are you referring to? It's no longer really helping us understand who the guy is. It's extra information about someone we still don't know. So it sounds really strange, even though grammatically it's correct. Often the same thing works the other way around. If you look at the last example, I'm going to change that into a defining clause, and it sounds very strange, but it's possible. Liam was the first applicant we saw today who wore an ugly tie, meaning we saw many applicants today wearing ugly ties, but Liam just happened to be the first. It's a very strange sentence, but it's possible. So some sentences just sound better defining or non-defining, depending on the information. Sometimes this difference can be really crucial to our understanding of the information. I'm going to show you a very important example, a good one to show your students. Here I have two sentences, almost exactly the same except for two little commas, but there is a huge difference in their meaning. So the first one, all the buildings which are old are scheduled to be demolished. This is defining, and I'm telling you that of all these buildings, the old ones are going to be destroyed. But in the second sentence, all the buildings which are old are scheduled to be demolished. I'm letting you know that all the buildings are going to be demolished, and they just so happen to be old. So as you can see, sometimes there is a huge difference in the meaning between a defining and a non-defining relative clause.